Welcome. Good evening, good afternoon. Thank you for coming out and joining us on a nice and thankfully cool sunny afternoon here on the Tempe campus at Arizona State. I'm William Anthony Hay, the Associate Director for Public Programs here at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. We are very glad to have you join us today for a lecture in the school's Civic Discourse Project. This will be the concluding lecture in the fall series of our 2024-25 CDP series. We resume in January with Andre Archie speaking for our Martin Luther King Day commemoration, and then our 2025 conference entitled The Road to Lexington and Concord, Imperial Crisis and the Making of American Political Order, 1763 to 1775. With the upcoming 250th anniversaries of American independence, SCETL is looking more and more at the path to a new American political order as part of our founding. In 1776, so the conference this February will be a step in that direction, with much more to follow. The theme this year is Sustaining American Political Order in History and Practice, which fits the conference very well. And today, barely a week after the 2024 elections, we have a timely discussion of the deficit here in both institutional competence and in public trust. Now, this is the school's SCETL's eighth year organizing the Civic Discourse Project for Arizona State and for the Phoenix community and for national audiences. We're very glad to continue our collaboration with Arizona PBS for another season of recording the Civic Discourse Project. You can explore the video archive of our speaker events and webinars on the school's YouTube channel and on our ASU website, all the events from 2017 onward. SCETL has worked for 8 years to convene a high-level conversation with the Civic Discourse Project. And this public program is an extension of the school's academic program, our courses, our curricula, degrees, and student experiences that strive to connect liberal arts and American civic education. So please stay tuned to our further events this spring. And now to our speaker today. Gerard Baker is the editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, with a weekly opinion column entitled Free Expression, and it runs every Monday. I think it ends up in the printed edition. We're in a brave new world of print and digital. And the printed edition's on Tuesday, or I see it on Tuesday. He's the author of a 2023 book, American Breakdown: Why We No Longer Trust Our Leaders and Institutions and How We Can Rebuild Confidence. And copies of that book will be available after his remarks for signing and purchase. Will be set up outside. A journalist for over 30 years, Baker served as the Wall Street Journal's editor-in-chief from 2013 to 2018. He wrote and broadcast earlier for outlets including the Financial Times, the London Times, and the British Broadcasting Corporation. Educated at Oxford's Corpus Christi College, he graduated with a first-class honors in philosophy, politics, and economics. And it's my pleasure to welcome Jerry Baker.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Professor, for that very kind introduction. Thank you all for being here. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, to be at Arizona State, to be here associated with SCETL. Particular privilege to come to Arizona at this particular time in the political cycle. I know you must all greatly appreciate the fact, those of you who are Arizona residents, that you are people who live in just one of the 7 states that decide who becomes president of the United States. So congratulations on that, and indeed on the direction of the Senate too. So it's I'm sure it's great for you to have that special role in the Electoral College. And it's a particular pleasure to be here at Arizona State. I have 5 daughters who have all attended U.S. colleges. None of them, unfortunately, in Arizona, all in very, very dark, cold northern climes. I wish they had maybe been out here, and we could have. It would have been a rather pleasanter experience. But I know what a terrific educational experience those of you who are here are receiving, and it's a great pleasure to be part of that. And again, as I say, I particularly want to associate myself with SCETL and the work that Professor Hay and his colleagues do here, I'm going to talk a bit about the trust deficit that has arisen in the United States, which I do think is perhaps one of the core, if not the core, malfunction, if you like, in American democracy right now. And I think part of the way in which we rebuild trust is we rebuild trust in the values that made America a great country. And restoring discourse, civil discourse, at a time when we live in such bitter times of bitter partisan acrimony, I think is extraordinarily important. And understanding, especially in certain, I won't say which ones, but in certain areas of higher education, where I think the discourse has become not only very, very partisan and very acrimonious, but also very divorced, I think, from the principles of American democracy and of the American Republic. And it's great that SCETL is helping to rebuild some of the virtues of that civil discourse. I should, as you heard from Will, that was a very nice introduction. I'm not originally from the United States, as you might be able to tell from my accent. In fact, it was a bit of a shock to me when I came to the United States for the first time and was told I had an accent. Being English, we thought that you all had accents, but apparently we're wrong. I've been very fortunate to live in the US, though, for 30 years, and I'm very proud to say I became an American citizen just last year. So I got my first opportunity to vote this year. That was quite an experience. In New York, didn't make any difference, unlike in Arizona, to the outcome, but it was a great pleasure. But as you heard from Will, my background, I have been a journalist for 30 years, and I was very fortunate to have worked for the Wall Street Journal for the last 15 years. I became editor of the journal, editor-in-chief in 2013, and I often feel when I give presentations like this, and have done over quite a long period of time now, that I do feel as someone obviously who comes from England, has an English background, I can always tell when I speak to groups like this that people say, how was he editor of the Wall Street Journal? How did a Brit become editor of the Wall Street Journal? I thought we threw you people out of here 250 years ago. Why are you running our newspapers? And I have to say, I was very fortunate to do that. But I think it does also reflect, to some extent, the role that we British, those of us who were born in Britain anyway, the sort of self-image that we have about our role in the world. Britain, as you know, has long since ceased to be an important country in the world, long since ceased to be an important power. A long time ago, it was eclipsed by the United States a long, long time ago. And yet the British people never quite gave up on that sense that they mattered in the world. Despite all evidence to the contrary, the British always continued to think that they had some role to play, and a tremendously elevated sense of their own importance. And the best way I can always think of to illustrate this is to tell a little joke that the British like to say about themselves. And it goes like this. One day, God calls down from heaven, and he calls on President Biden, President Xi Jinping of China, and the new British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, and calls them up to heaven. And he says to them, I've got very important news for you. The world is going to end tomorrow, and you've got to get your people ready for it. So President Biden goes back to Washington, goes on national television, says to the American people, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is there is a God, and we, God-fearing, religious, for the most part, Americans, have been right about that all along. The bad news is I've met him, and he's told me the world's going to end tomorrow, and we've got to get ready for it. President Xi goes back to Beijing, goes on Chinese television and says, I've got bad news, and frankly, even worse news. The bad news is there is a God, and we godless Marxists have been wrong about that all along. And the worst news is I've met him, and he's told me the world's going to end tomorrow, and we've got to get ready for it. The Prime Minister of Britain, Keir Starmer, goes back to London, goes on national television and says to the British people, great news. God considers me to be one of the 3 most important people in the world. So that'll give you a sense. I apologise for if we Brits continue to think, despite all the evidence, that we still have something important to say. So I'm just going to talk a little bit here, and then Will and I are going to have a discussion and open it up to questions from you too about the themes of my book, which, as he's very kindly said, was published last year, and I do believe there are going to be copies available for me to sign for you afterwards. The book is about trust, or, as I said, the collapse really in trust. It's called American Breakdown, the breakdown of trust that Americans have in their major institutions. And I really do think this is, if not the central, then one of the central elements of what has created so much political and civic and social discord in this country in the last 20 or 30 years or so. Why we have so much bitter partisanship, why there is so many Americans feel consistently that their country is on the wrong track. We've just had obviously a very important election, an historic election, in which a president, for the first time in 130 years, a president who left office 4 years ago was re-elected 4 years later. And I think, as you saw, and we'll doubtless talk to some extent about the election and what happened and why. I do think you'll see from the opinion polls, I think the underlying cause of this is this underlying dissatisfaction that the American people understandably have with the state of the country. Most 2/3 of people say to opinion pollsters the country's on the wrong track. That has been consistently the case, with a few very, very brief exceptions over the last 20 years. Large majorities of Americans thinking that the country is on the wrong track, whoever is in the Oval Office, whoever controls the levers of political power. And again, I think this comes down to, it's both a product of, but also a reflection of this decline in trust that we've seen in this country over the last 20 years. And it's a broad decline in trust across literally all of the major institutions in this country, political, legal, civic, civil society institutions in this country. According to surveys that are taken, trust has declined in all of those institutions dramatically. Now, I work, as you know, in the media and have done for 30 years. I've been in the American newspaper business for almost 30 years. And I've seen firsthand the collapse in trust in the American media, which I think is it is the most dramatic illustration of this decline in trust. And let me give you an example, I think, exactly why that trust has declined so precipitously in such a relatively short period of time. On June the 7th this year, the Wall Street Journal, my newspaper, published an article which was about President Joe Biden's mental capabilities, cognitive capabilities. And the reporter spoke to large numbers of people close to Biden, in his administration, in the White House, political opponents, political allies, people overseas that he met, a large number of them, and almost all of them reported the same thing, that President Biden's mind was slower than it had been, that he was forgetting things, he was having sort of cognitive challenges, not uncommon in an 81-year-old man. And this story was on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The next day, the story was not only angrily denied, of course, by the White House, but also by almost all of the rest of the media. The New York Times, which the quote, when this story became discussed and people looked at videos of President Biden maybe not looking at his sharpest, the New York Times ran a headline saying it was Russian disinformation. Russian disinformation videos smear Biden ahead of US election. Other news organizations attacked the Wall Street Journal, said this was a partisan hit job. It was completely unfair. President Biden was as fresh as a daisy and as sharp as a tack. And this was untrustworthy political journalism. Again, you expect that from politicians. You expect them to defend themselves. What was so striking and shocking to me was the way the rest of the media, from the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN, NBC, the major television news networks, went after not the subject of the story, i.e. the question of the president's capabilities, but the reporters and the Journal and the Wall Street Journal itself. That was on June the 7th, June the 8th. On June the 27th, many of you will recall, if you saw it, we had the first and only presidential debate this cycle between President Trump and President Biden, and it became immediately obvious to everybody, if there was any doubt, that indeed President Biden was suffering from significant cognitive decline. And that, to me, is an example of what's gone wrong, so much gone wrong with the media. People not only did they spring to the defense of President Biden, but I think it suggested very clearly that, and we got to know this, that over the last couple of years, news organizations whose job it is to tell us the news, to tell us the information as it is, whether it favors one particular political view or another, have increasingly abandoned that role. And, in this case, have over the last couple of years essentially colluded with the White House in covering up Joe Biden's evident and gathering frailty. And I think, again, that's, to me, explains why, to cite these opinion surveys that I talked about at the start, why trust in the media has dropped so dramatically. And Gallup Gallup and other organizations, the Pew Research Group, also do these annual surveys of trust, public trust that people have in their institutions. And trust in the media, back in the 1970s, after Watergate, something like 75% of Americans said they had a high level of confidence, a high level of trust in their media, in their major news organizations. They trusted them largely to tell the truth, to be fair, to be objective. 75% 50 years ago. That declined steadily in the latter part of the last century. In the last 20 years, it's gone down from about 50% at the beginning of the century down to now about 30% of Americans say they have a high level of trust in their media. It's the most precipitous decline. And again, as I said, as editor of the Wall Street Journal, I watched this. I watched how people came to distrust news. I'm glad to say, and I'm not just saying this because I was the editor of the Journal, but it was the Journal actually, if you break it down, the level of the decline of trust in the Journal was lower than other news organizations. And, I think the Journal does continue to have higher standards than others. And I'm sure those of you who are readers of the Journal will agree with me. And if you're not readers of the Journal, I'm happy to sell you a subscription outside afterwards. But my point, joking aside, the larger point is that across the board, conservative media, liberal media, however you want to characterize it, trust has collapsed. People just simply don't trust those news organizations anymore to tell the truth. And I think we saw, by the way, in this 2024 election, I wrote in my column this week for the Wall Street Journal that if the 2016 election, when the media did become rather frenzied about Donald Trump, if the 2016 election was the handwriting on the wall for media in terms of public trust, then to extend the biblical analogy, 2024 was the collapse of Babylon for the media. I think the media have ceased to, on a very, very wide scale. And that's a problem for our society because if we don't have information that we can trust, or if we only have information that people trust if it suits their particular political priors, then we don't really have valuable information at all. And more importantly, we don't have the basis for a civil discourse, the basis for discussion about what happens, what's going on in the world, and how to address the challenges in the world and how to address the challenges that face this country. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great Democratic senator from New York in the 60s and 70s, and I think even into the 80s, when he would argue with people, he famously used to say, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. And actually, we have now, God rest his soul, got to the point where that's no longer true. You're not only now entitled to your own opinion in this country, and indeed in much of the world, you're also entitled to your own facts, thanks to increasing polarization, thanks to the ease of access that we get to news that we want to get through digital media. We can essentially block ourselves off from any information we don't want to hear, and that's increasingly what has happened to the media. And as I say, it's incredibly damaging to the health of democracy. And I'll come on a little bit, talk about how we can fix that. But I want to move on from the media because, in fact, the reason I wrote this book is I wanted to address this question of trust in the media. What had gone wrong? Why had this happened? But as I looked at the data and I looked at what the polling data said about people's trust in the media, it was evident that trust across American institutions had declined precipitously. And it wasn't just the media. It is fair to say, I'm sorry to say, the media has probably seen the steepest fall. But across government and private sector, Americans used to trust the federal government, the judiciary, law enforcement, big business, the media, universities, higher education, technology companies in the last 20 years or so, public health officials, high levels of trust in all of those institutions across America, across American society. Some of them, as recently as 2020, 80% of people trusted big business, essentially, to do the right thing. That number is down to below 50% today. Federal government, you won't be surprised to hear, again, over 50% used to trust the federal government to do the right thing. That number is down into the 30% range today. The judiciary, the trust has declined dramatically in the judiciary. Technology companies, as I said, has declined really significantly. I'm sorry to say to be here at a distinguished institute of higher education, but higher education and education more generally, the education profession, teachers, professors, people have lost trust in them. And most strikingly, as I was doing this research, it's not only that Americans have lost trust in those institutions, they've also lost trust in each other. And this is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Ask people, again, 30 years ago, did they generally think that other Americans could be trusted to do the right thing? You'd get a number of around 80 to 90%. That number has also fallen below 50%. And the reason this is so important is that trust, social capital, as economists, sociologists call it, is really essential to the functioning of any society. If you think about the way in which you go about your life, your daily life, you have to just have a level of implicit trust in so many things that you do. You trust food companies to be producing food that's been properly prepared for you. When you go to a restaurant, you have high levels of trust that the food has been properly prepared, that it's been properly served, that it's not going to poison you. We just do that. We just do that automatically. When you get on an aeroplane, you trust that the plane has been maintained properly. You trust that the pilots haven't been on a bender the night before and aren't going to be crashing the plane for you. You trust that the air traffic control system is going to work exactly as it should do. Everything we do in our daily lives, in our relations with each other, in our relations as consumers with business or as business with consumers, and most importantly of all, as members of civil society, as part of a democracy, in our trust in government and the institutions that lead us, everything we do depends on trusting in order for us to be able to function both as a democracy and both, frankly, as an effective economy. And if those levels of trust have declined as they have, and we've seen this in other societies, this is what I think is so concerning about what's gone on in the United States. When you have declining levels of trust, we've seen it in societies, then those societies break apart. People trust only a section of society, only their side, only their tribe, only their family, their community, their narrow community. And society itself begins to essentially disintegrate. And we're not there yet, thank God. We still have a functioning civic society and a functioning democracy, but the pace at which we're headed towards mistrust, mutual mistrust and institutional mistrust is so great that I think it does pose a real challenge, and I think it's one of the things that we have to fix, all of us have to fix, our leaders have to fix, in government, in business, in society. We have to make sure that we fix it. So, just briefly, let me say what's gone wrong. What's caused this lack of trust in the last 20 years or so? And I talk about this in some detail in the book. I think there are a number of factors. There's obviously been, if you like, a kind of institutional failure at many levels in the United States over the last 20 years. And if you look at this period that I'm talking about, this decline of trust has been particularly marked since the year 2000. In the last 20 years, that's when the level of trust in all of these institutions has declined. And again, I think part of that is to do with institutional failure. I think people have lost trust in government, in part because of failures of government, big, spectacular, frankly, failures of government that have weakened the United States and weakened its ability to get things done, and understandably produced a level of mistrust among the people. Look at the major defining political events, if you like, of the last 20 years. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly the war in Iraq. By the way, I'd say at the time, I supported that war. I thought it was the right thing to do. But it obviously was both flawed in its conception and in its preparation, and very, very flawed in its execution. And Americans, I think, you look back now, ask them what they think about that war, they think it was a terrible mistake. And that was arguably the defining foreign policy decision of the first 10 years of the 21st century. Then we had the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009. That was an indictment not only of certain financial institutions who had taken on excessive risk. It was an indictment, seen as an indictment in many ways by the government, because the government was, first of all, didn't do anything in advance to prevent this worst financial crisis that we'd had in 80 years, leading to the worst economic depression, the recession that we'd had in 80 years as well. But also there was a sense that people who actually were responsible for this crisis were actually rewarded. They were bailed out. Government actively moved to help those institutions that had precipitated the crisis, help them to restore their balance sheets, and nobody went to prison. Nobody seemed to suffer any accountability for it. It was a major break. It led to the Tea Party movement, which I think ultimately led to Donald Trump and the kind of rebellion of so many voters against the government. But it led also, above all, to mistrust in the government. And then, of course, the third big event of the last 20 years was the COVID pandemic. And again, mishandled by government, mishandling in terms of information, mishandling in terms of arguably of the response, the immediate response to the pandemic, and certainly this is reflected again in opinion polls, in the view of most Americans, mishandled in the way in which society was shut down in many parts of the country. Schools were closed, work was closed, people were isolated in ways that probably now we can understand were probably not necessary. So these three major events all led to a decline in trust. As I said, on the business side, we had scandals, we had the financial crisis. That led to a decline in trust. And then we have this problem of partisanship. That has led to a decline in trust. One of the interesting things that lies behind this decline that we've seen in levels of trust that people express is that people tend to trust people who are on their side. So when the federal government is controlled by Republicans, as it's about to be in a couple of months, you can guarantee that levels of trust among Republicans in the federal government will rise and levels of trust from Democrats will decline. We've not seen that on such a scale before in the United States, this hyper-partisanship where people tend to only believe. It's not even that they approve of a particular government or disapprove of another government. They actually to the point where they only believe what they hear from a government that they are politically sympathetic with. So that's led to a decline in trust. I think the most important thing, though, and this is where I spend a lot of time in the book examining this, is I do think that there's a deeper problem with what's happened to the United States and its institutions in the last 20 years. And that is that many of these institutions have essentially been captured by an ideological set, if you like, a group of people with a particular ideological viewpoint that actually I think is quite inimical to the traditions of American values, of American history. It is true in the media, most dramatically. This is one of the reasons people stop trusting the media. The media is increasingly controlled by people of a particular ideological viewpoint, increasingly practiced by people of a particular progressive political viewpoint. It's true in universities, many universities, I'm sure not this one, but many universities across the country have become captured by an increasingly intolerant, narrow orthodoxy. It's true in large parts of the permanent government, not so much the political government, the elected government, which changes, but the permanent government has again been captured by people of this ilk. And it's true increasingly of a lot of big business too, that businesses have become increasingly attached to these ideological positions that I think have alienated large numbers of Americans. What do I mean? What are we talking about? I think what I'm talking about is a post-Cold War. Remember, think back, those of you who are old enough, and those of you who aren't, go and study it in the history books, to where we were in the 1990s, which we remember very, very well, some of us. The United States had won the Cold War. The United States and its allies, under US leadership, firm leadership, had won the Cold War, had triumphed over communism, largely peacefully. And at the end of the 20th century, it looked as though the US model of free market capitalism, of free people, that system was simply, unquestionably, the most successful, not only most successful in terms of its outcomes, but actually morally most, if you like, most virtuous system that the world had ever seen. And the US led that. People talked about the end of history. That was that free markets, liberal societies, liberal kind of market capitalism and political and civic freedoms had been demonstrated beyond question to be the dominant global political system. And we got there and, it looked like, again, people talked about the end of history, what would come next. And I think, unfortunately, what happened, though, was that the debates, the fundamental divide that we had through the Cold War between, if you like, Marxism and capitalism and neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, that then transposed itself after the Cold War into internal contention about what kind of a country, what kind of a society the United States, which had triumphed, remember its system had triumphed, but what kind of system that really was. And what happened was a very large number of people who believed that, despite the evidence to the contrary, that the US was somehow fundamentally flawed, embraced a kind of set of ideologies that I think became dominant among a sort of intellectual elite. These ideologies were globalism, the idea that global integration was not only a good, an economic good, but a kind of moral good, that the idea of the nation state was somehow morally questionable, and that we should open ourselves up, both in terms of business and in terms of migrations and everything else, to as much of the world as possible. It became this globalist ideal became to dominate in the 1990s and 2000s under both political parties, this consensus that opening up the United States, opening up the world to whether it's free flow of people, capital, goods, was the right thing to do, and in the process undermined the very idea of the nation state. That's why we ended up with the kind of border crisis that we've had. It's why we ended up with so many people feeling disillusioned by what had happened with businesses being exported overseas. So globalism was the first element of this creed that simply if you like, took over the leader, was subscribed to by the leaders of all these institutions, and became the dominant ideological creed, if you like, in so many of America's institutions. The second was this strong commitment, the strong belief in what might be called sustainability, green ideology, green policies which was closely allied actually to the phenomenon of globalism. The idea that the planet was in peril thanks to overuse of fossil fuels, and that the country and the world needed to completely be transformed through regulation, through the cancelling of traditional forms of energy. And this became kind of, we've seen it became almost like a religion. As kind of traditional religion declined, this sort of green ideology became a passionate belief of so many people. And again, it was the belief that was subscribed to by most of the people, again, on both sides of the political spectrum, in our political institutions and more broadly in our civic and social institutions too. That was the second leg of it. The third leg was what might be called, for want of a better term, kind of woke progressive ideology, that where we had previously, our principal debates had been along economic lines about the right level, the right size of government, the role of government, whether we should, the level of economic redistribution, taxation and spending. This ideology of what I would call essentially kind of self-loathing on the part of the West. And again, these things are not just confined to the United States, but this idea that America was sort of fundamentally a wicked country, that far from being the triumphant country of the post-Cold War era, the end of history, where we had demonstrated that America's system was the greatest on earth, people became very focused on the internal flaws, if you like, within the US. Obviously going back, race, historic flaw in the United States, gender, sexuality. And these issues rose to the top and became, again, a kind of creed for so many of our leaders in both political and non-political institutions. And we got down this route of, again, what we might call woke, what you're all familiar with, woke progressivism, where, and not just the promotion of that ideology about fundamentally how wicked the United States has been and how it owes a tremendous debt to so many people, but also that it became exclusive too. In so many institutions, it became the dominant and exclusive ideology. So I think that's those three elements of of this new philosophy, of this new elite philosophy, if you like, of the people who dominated our institutions. I think that is the core reason why these institutions became so distant, why they alienated so many Americans, and why Americans have come to mistrust them so much. How do we change that? How do we restore trust? very briefly, I think there's a few things that we can do, and again, I talk about this in the book. One thing we need to do is to bring these institutions, all institutions, back closer to the people. Accountability is critical. We've lost accountability. There's a sense that many Americans have that their institutions, whether it's the media, whether it's universities, whether it's to some extent the government, even when they elect the government, that there is no accountability. We need to do that. One of the interesting things I discovered as I researched this topic was that levels of trust in places like the federal government and big business have declined dramatically, levels of trust in institutions that are closer to Americans, local government, small businesses, have actually risen over the last 20 years. And so I think part of the answer, and that's because people feel that those institutions are more accountable. They are more responsive to the needs of people. And I think part of the answer is to make sure that all of our institutions become more responsive, that we get more genuine democratic control over our institutions from what we've seen before. Second thing I think that can be done is the institutions themselves have to recognize how far they've got from the values that Americans appreciate. I think this is particularly true in the media. It's also true, I think, in academia, that there has to be some soul searching on the part of these institutions as to why they've become how they've become so ideologically attached. The people who work for them, the demographics of the people who work for them. The media, again, I know this is where I've spent a lot of time in my life, is dominated by these bi-coastal elite communities, largely underrepresenting the most Americans in the rest of the country. There has to be a greater effort on the part of all of these institutions to be genuinely diverse, which means not just diverse in the way that people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and things like race and gender, but genuinely diverse ideologically and genuinely diverse geographically and demographically. We have to do a better job of making sure that people, that we are not part of this sort of narrow bi-coastal bubble that so many American institutions have become dominated by. And the third thing I think that will lead to change is political change. I think one of the problems in this country for the last 20 years, and one of the reasons, again, trust has declined so much, is we haven't really had a decisive political moment in this country. We have a very divided country. Election after election is decided 50-50. Even this last election, which looks like a decisive result, with the Republicans winning the presidency, the Senate, and almost certainly the House, and making big gains in large parts of the country, it's still going to come down to like a 50%, 49% split in the popular vote. And what this means is you don't get clarity, you don't get decisiveness. When you have an election with a clear outcome, 1964 when LBJ won, and that was an affirmation of his agenda, the civil rights movement, obviously the Great Society, and the other changes that he introduced. That changed the political culture and people went along with it. The Republicans had to change to adjust to that. 1984, when Ronald Reagan won, the other way around. Democrats realized that because of the scale of Reagan's victory, because of the scale of the Republican domination at that point, they had to change. They had to accept that the country had moved on. We don't have that clarity in American politics. And until we do, I think we will struggle to break out of this highly partisan, highly polarized environment where people simply say, well, they don't accept the results of elections sometimes. Most elections these days, people challenge them and say they're illegitimate. But even if they do accept them, they think, well, there's going to be another election in 2 years' time. It's a close race. We can win. But I think there has to be, for trust to be restored in American politics and American government, I think we do need to see a moment of decision where the country goes in one direction or the other. So just in conclusion, it is a worrying picture. The decline in trust in this country is a worrying thing for all the reasons I've said. It's unprecedented, certainly since people have been keeping records of these things. But I'm optimistic still. I'm optimistic partly because America's been through these challenges before, although this particular, in the last 50 years, is unprecedented. America's been through periods of intense polarization and intense mutual mistrust. Obviously, at the early days of the Republic, we had a very polarized country. We had a very polarized country, obviously, in the 1850s. That ended in civil war. I hope we don't end up in that direction. But think about the 1960s. The 1960s, the country was very polarized. Levels of trust in public institutions were extremely low. And America came through that again, I think, partly through resolving its differences politically and ultimately peacefully. And I'm optimistic that having been through all of those challenges, it will do so again. again, as I said at the beginning, I became an American citizen recently, and I became an American citizen mainly because I love this country. I came here, I admired this country as a young man growing up in England. I admired this country, what it stood for, what it represented in the world, that it was a beacon of not only freedom, obviously most importantly, a beacon of liberty for so many people growing up in Europe during the Cold War. Those of you who ever saw it would understand how important what America stood for, what that meant for people who were struggling to achieve their own freedom. And I came to admire this country and then to love this country and to recognize that this country and its values have made more of a positive impact on the world than every other political system, I include the British system in that, than every other political system, every other cultural system. The United States has been a bigger force for good in the history of the world than any other country since civilizations first began to form. And I have that faith in this country that, having been through challenges before, but through faithfulness to those values that have been so powerful and so virtuous for the world, I have continuing faith that the US will, with some of these things that I think need to be done, will come through these challenges. And I'll just conclude by saying, as kind of testimony to that, I'd like to quote something that's often attributed to Winston Churchill, who was also a great Americaphile, had American connections. And he said, supposedly, that when he was talking about America, he would say, the thing about America is America can always be relied upon to do the right thing, but only after it's exhausted every other alternative. So thank you very much. I think we're going to have a question and answer now with Will.
Well, Jerry, thank you very much for a lively discussion, lively talk, and congratulations on becoming an American citizen.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So we're glad to have you with us, have you on site. Let me appeal to our audience. We are open for questions. If you have a question, please ask it. If you have a speech, don't give it. We have a microphone set up so we can all hear you and so we can record. So please step forward. Let me open with a question of my own, the moderator's prerogative. You mentioned the bicoastal elites and the bicoastality of America. And it's interesting, if you look at a map of electoral votes by congressional district, not by state, but by district, by county, how much of it is red and how little of it is blue. Red for the Republicans, blue for Democrats. And you see patches. Mississippi Delta is solidly Democrat. And then you see parts of other areas that you wouldn't think, even on the coast, that are pretty red. What about New York, where you now live? That's an example. The city of New York is an example where government has gone wrong. Many of us remember New York in an earlier period that it had profound problems. The pre-Rudolph Giuliani era, issues of crime, issues of economic decline, jobs went elsewhere. And then New York came back. And just as a story for a moment, I remember being in New York after a long absence from visiting in 2005. And it was a beautiful autumn day, a beautiful September day. And I was struck at how nice it was to be in New York City. And the things that I'd remembered from before weren't there, but all the nice things were there. That's changed, and now we're back to the 1970s, back to the 1980s. What went wrong, and why is it that the New York establishment, and this is a center of American business, a center of American culture, you can see some of this in the second city, in Chicago too. Why is it that things slipped so far? Why haven't they fixed it?
Yeah, you're right about New York. I've lived there on and off for about half of the 30 years that I've lived in the US. I've lived in New York, and I do love New York City. It's a great city. There's so much to do. It's I always think when you ask questions like that, Will, I think of the Woody Allen quote about New York City, which he once said, apparently, New York City, it's a great place to live, but I wouldn't want to visit there, which I think does capture it rather well. Or, and it's always had these rather eccentric political figures. Ed Koch, who was the mayor in the late 70s and 1980s, the independent mayor, very sort of eccentric figure who was, renowned for doing some sort of strange things. at a time, quite challenging time for the city. And when he ran for re-election, I think it was in 1984, he said to the voters of New York, look, this is what I say to you, the voters of New York. Here are the 10 things that I think are most important for the city for the next 4 years. And I want you to think about them. And think about these 10 things and look at them. And if you agree with me on, say, 6 of those things, then vote for me. If you agree with me on all 10 of those things, you should go and see your psychiatrist. So look, so there are a number of things that have gone wrong. Firstly, I think, frankly, it comes back to, I'm sorry to sort of hammer on that same drum that I was talking about in my remarks. It comes down to the capture of the political, especially the Democratic Party in New York. Democratic Party, like all big cities, controls New York. It's a one-party state, much more rigidly one-party state than anything North Korea has been able to achieve. Even though, in this last election, actually Donald Trump did manage to get about almost 30% of the New York City vote. Typically, Democrats get 80 to 90% of the vote. So it's a one-party state, which leads to a complete lack of accountability for a start. There's no real change. All the competition for political control is within one party. It's the same in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C. All of these cities essentially are one-party cities, and that is not a healthy state of affairs. As I say, I think it's also that these cities have become captured by, these party establishments have been captured by this very ideologically focused leaders who are focused not on the interests of the city, really, or their constituents, but on promoting these ideological aims, whether it's, again, particularly on issues of the woke, if you like, the woke agenda, on some of the sort of progressive cultural ideals. I also think that there's been, the New York is trapped at the moment, and again, so are some other cities, in a sort of fiscal spiral, which is that there is very, very high levels of fiscal support for the relatively disadvantaged. Something like 2/3 of New York City residents are receiving some kind of either federal or state or city assistance. In order to maintain this, taxes have to be put up very, very high. And when taxes, and the New York State income tax, top rate of income tax is 12%, 12.5%. On top of that, there's a New York City income tax, which the top rate is 4%. So you're paying 16% if you earn above a certain income in New York. In addition to your federal top rate of tax, which is 37% right now, and some other taxes, the marginal rate of tax, in other words, for many people who live in New York City is close to 60%. So what effect does this have? People leave. Large numbers of people left. They left, during the pandemic because of the quality of life issues then. And then with these taxes constantly going up to pay for this very, very large proportion of the population that needs public assistance, they keep putting up taxes. That means people leave. That means the tax base shrinks. That means there's less money. The deficit rises. They have to put up taxes even more. We are in that kind of vicious spiral right now. Now, in the last year, actually, as it happens, the economy has been quite strong, so fiscal revenues have actually increased, and they won't, for the first time in many years, the state has said it won't be increasing taxes. But that's the kind of spiral. And by the way, you all here in Arizona, many, many people from New York, I know, come to live here or in Florida or Texas, relatively low tax environments, prosperous environments. They're escaping that kind of a crisis. So I think it's that combination of mismanagement, downward fiscal spiral, and the kind of and the lack of accountability for the political leadership that leaves New York City and these other major cities in America in this parlous state.
So the reality principle, testing against experience, against evidence, that ideology but also incentives work against that.
Yes, and again, the ideology is really important. Crime, so take the period when, in the last 50 years, when New York really did make real progress. It began really in the 1990s when Rudy Giuliani became mayor in 1991, I think that was. And he decided that, and at that point, similar situation to where the New York is now, actually worse in terms of crime. I lived in New York in 1990-91, and in that year, 1990, there were 2,500 homicides in New York City. I think by 2017, that number had gone down to 300. We'd seen an astonishing 90% decline in homicides and other serious crimes. Giuliani came in, tackled the crime issue with the famous sort of broken windows approach, tackling low-level crime, prosecuting crime properly, and crime, unsurprisingly declined. That led to an improved quality of life. That meant more people wanted to live in New York. Again, so instead of the vicious spiral we had a virtuous spiral where crime declined, the quality of life improved, more people wanted to live there, tax revenues increased. That meant that more people were able to be supported. It meant that there was more public investments and infrastructure. And we got into that virtuous circle. Unfortunately, and then we had Mike Bloomberg for 3 terms, who did a similar job, focused on crime, focused on making the city work well. Then we had the election of an extreme left-wing mayor, the Democratic Party pursuing these objectives. One thing, again, in my answer to your first question, I should have added was this issue of crime. Giuliani really tackled crime. We now, and again, this is true in so many American cities. It's true in, and there's a backlash against it. But we have prosecutors and a law enforcement environment, which essentially is, thinks that large numbers of crime shouldn't be prosecuted. It doesn't believe in carceral responses to crime, as they call it. People shouldn't go to prison. Well, surprise, surprise, that means crime rates go up. People commit more crimes. You've seen what's happened in San Francisco, where you had this. You've had it in LA. And as I say, it's very interesting. You're getting a political backlash in those cities. Gascon, the prosecutor in LA, was just defeated in the election last week. Chesa Boudin, the DA in San Francisco, was defeated in an election, and London Breed, the mayor of San Francisco, was just defeated too. There is this backlash. In New York City, those of you who visited will know it. I'm sure it's not the case in Tempe or in Phoenix. You walk into any store in New York City, almost everything is locked behind a cabinet. You can't, you're going to buy a tube of toothpaste in CVS. You have to summon someone to come and open the cabinet for you. That's because crime is just tolerated at an extraordinarily high level. So it's no wonder then that people, again, that's frankly an ideological thing. Alvin Bragg, the district attorney of New York, who was elected a couple of years ago, came in and the first thing he said was, I'm not going to prosecute a whole range of non-violent crimes. Surprise, surprise, non-violent crimes increase. So it's that ideological capture. Some of the things I was talking about in my remarks and I write about in my book that I'm afraid has led to the real dramatic decline in not just in trust levels, but in the actual quality of life of people, so many people in this country.
Choices have consequences. And we have a question from our audience.
Yes, hi, thank you. You mentioned the echo chamber that we can find ourselves in when you were talking about the partisanship and the polarization. What role do you think social media has played in that, this genie that's out of the bottle? You would think it would help because there's more information, but it seems maybe not to have helped. And what do you think are some solutions for not letting ourselves get stuck in that echo chamber?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In many ways, core to some of these problems with the media in particular. I remember, and again, I write about this in the book, in 2000 when the internet came along, most of you weren't around then, but I remember it very well. I can remember the claims that were made, this is going to be the most amazing innovation, we've ever seen in sort of the history of human knowledge. You would be able to, I remember Al Gore, who invented the internet, you'll recall, those of you remember, saying at the time, we're going to have an Athenian-style democracy in America because everybody's going to have access to all the information you could possibly need or want in the world at their fingertips. We didn't even have smartphones then, but on our computers, we were going to have this information and we were going to be the best informed citizenry in the history of the planet. It would lead to better governance. It would lead to better decision making. We were entering a period of kind of political and civic nirvana. Well, how is that working out for you? And your point, ma'am, about social media is critical here because, of course, what happened was far from exposing people to all this information, objective information, data that you could possibly want in order to inform your decision making, we think social media came along, started to sort of segregate us, if you like, into groups, whether initially, the original social media, the original Facebook was, university, started on university campuses and then obviously exploded into being a broad social network, literally. But instead of opening us up, it actually closed us down and put us into these sort of silos where increasingly we only exposed ourselves to information that suited us, only communicated with or socialized with people that we agreed with, and created this kind of siloization of American society, which I think has been an important factor in increasing partisanship. So social media, to answer your question, the long answer to your question, has been unfortunately crucial in that. Now, the only thing I would say is, first of all, again, this isn't new. I mean, as a historian, we'll know this very well, that even before the internet came along and digital media came along, we had high levels of partisanship in American society. The early days of the Republic, as I said in my opening remarks, were characterized by intense, vicious partisanship, including in the media. It's still, most newspapers in this country were essentially partisan newspapers for a long, long time. It's still reflected in the names of newspapers like, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette or, the Republican Leader in places like that. Or, so we've had that partisanship before, that partisanship not just of political identification, but partisanship of information and of access to information. And we have come through it. And we came through it to some extent because we got to a point, and I'd like to think the Wall Street Journal has a small creditable role to play in this. We got to the point where people had this partisan information they couldn't really trust. They only trusted their own side, and they didn't really have objectively verifiable information. And there started to become a demand. People wanted to have objectively verifiable information. Partly they needed it for important decisions about their life, about investment decisions or consumption decisions or what they were going to do for their job. So they started to demand information that was actually trustworthy. And the Wall Street Journal, we recently celebrated the 125th anniversary of the Wall Street Journal's founding. The very first issue of the Wall Street Journal carried on its front page an editorial by, there were three guys who founded the Wall Street Journal, one called Mr. Dow, one called Mr. Jones, and one called Mr. Bergstrasser. Poor old Mr. Bergstrasser got rather left out in the way that history sometimes does, kind of ignore people. But they issued a manifesto on that first place saying, most of the news you get today you can't trust because it comes from one side or the other. We're going to put out a newspaper that gives you hard information and facts and is going to avoid mixing up opinion and facts. That was 135 years ago. So I think that's my hope, that it might be a slightly vain hope and a forlorn hope, but that I think over time people will start to realize that they actually do need information that they can trust. And they can't just, if they're just reading, the New York Times or just watching Fox News or just getting information from these social media or digital sites that are providing one side of the argument, they're going to start to say this isn't sufficient and we actually need more. So I think, again, history certainly tells us that when we've had these periods where the media has been extremely partisan and extremely divisive, if you like, there's come a time, over time, where people have actually wanted something that gave them something that was more objective. And I think that will happen again.
Yeah. Please, we have a microphone for questions, and I'll turn to our next questioner.
Thank you and good evening. Sir, I just got a question. I want to stay on the media route here for a second. What are your thoughts on private-owned media companies and private-owned media in general, like podcasts? I'm just curious to hear about what effects it has on the American public's opinions and also with the election that happened.
That's been a huge area of growth, obviously, in the last 10 years or so. Traditional media like mine or television or radio has been steadily declining in terms of its share of, now as it happens, newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times have seen a big increase in circulation in the last few years as other newspapers, regional newspapers, local newspapers have declined. I don't know the details about the local newspapers here in Phoenix, but I do know that they've seen really substantial declines in circulation. A few papers, a handful of papers like ours have grown, but most traditional newspapers have declined in terms of circulation readership. television news has declined dramatically. When I was growing up, when I was a student in the 1980s in the United States, something like 50, 60 million Americans every night tuned into one of three network news programs, either ABC, CBS, or NBC. 50, 60 million out of a population then of 240, 250 million. Astonishing reach they had. Today, a country of nearly 350 million people, those three networks reach maybe 20 million people between them, if that, and that would be on a good night. So we've seen this massive diffusion of media. Many more people get their information from as you say, sort of new digital media, from all kinds of other forms of information. The podcast thing you mentioned is fascinating. I mean, that has become, we all know, we've all been familiar now, we've just followed this election campaign, the importance, the role that podcasts has played and the important role that the candidates assigned to podcasters. Joe Rogan's famously 80 million audience, for his Donald Trump interview. They are definitely reaching more people than my newspaper. My newspaper reaches maybe 5 million people a day. That's a fraction of what these new sites, look at Twitter, X as it is now, Elon Musk, that is seen by literally 2/3 of the American population in the course of a month. They get that people get more and more information from that than they do from traditional news organizations like mine. What I think is, and that's just going on, and I think that will continue, and traditional news will continue to decline, and alternative and modern sources will increase. The one thing I think is that, and that's all, I think that's fine. I think that, people will choose to get their information where they choose to get their information. It's a free market. We live in a free market economy. That's all fine. The one thing that I think where maybe there is still a role for traditional news, if only they would embrace it, but they've abandoned it, and that is actually in reporting and telling people what is actually going on. Podcasts, so much of what we see on social media, frankly, what I do and what other people do is opinion. It's expressing opinion, it's taking facts, I hope, most of the time, good facts, reliable facts, and expressing an opinion about them. Or it's Joe Rogan talking with a guest about whatever, and they're expressing opinions. But there's still a real hunger and need for reported information, and actual information that, somebody once said that news is something that somebody powerful doesn't want you to know. Everything else is public relations and advertising. And it's true. And the role of news organizations in investing in reporting and finding out facts, those are the things ultimately that are much more important, even if they're only read, even if that first news publication is only read by 1 million people as opposed to the podcast as 80 million people, that information spreads like a virus through the system and becomes the basis of people's understanding of what's going on in the world. That's what the modern media, these new media outlets generally don't do, can't do, don't have the resources to do. If the traditional media like mine, and again, I think the Journal does a better job than others, but if traditional media, newspapers, television, had stuck to doing that and doing reporting and telling people what was going on rather than blurring the lines between reporting and opinion, which they have done, I think they would discover that they have a much more valuable role and a much more, frankly, valuable business model than they currently have. But having allowed the facts, the reporting of the facts to be essentially subsumed by this desire to tell people how to think and to tell people opinions, I think they've kind of lost the plot. So I would say that while all of these new platforms, these new forms of media are incredibly important, there still has to be a role for people, for diligent, hardworking reporters to find out information that people don't want to know. And that still is the information that ultimately really informs the way people make their judgments about the world.
I mean, that's a very important point. It's cheap to provide opinion. It's very expensive to provide reported fact. And think about the role of foreign correspondents, war reporting, and the overseas news, and just tracking not necessarily dramatic events, war in Ukraine, for example, what happened in Gaza and Israel, but just mundane patterns of reporting on the production rates and economic reporting that requires someone on the ground, that costs a lot more money than the other models of what I would call the CNN model of having people just commenting on whatever comes over the transom. And that's harder to sustain, but it's valuable.
Yeah.
I'm struck that early newspapers, if you look at the front page of a newspaper circa 1800, they were all ads.
Yeah.
Because that was the basis under which newspapers thrived.
I'll give you an example. So when I was editor of the Journal, I know we've got other questions, so I'll quickly answer this, but when I was editor of the Journal, we did a number of very big stories. We broke a number of very big stories reporting. And I'll give you two contrasting stories. We won a Pulitzer Prize for one story, which was we broke the story about Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump. Those of you, I don't need to go into too much detail about that, but you'll know that. We won a Pulitzer for that, which I think in the end was great, and our reporting was terrific, but, it didn't really, matter that much, I think, in the ultimate analysis. And the second, one of the other biggest stories we did was we broke the story about Theranos. I don't know if many of you remember this, but it was a medical testing firm set up by a woman called Elizabeth Holmes in Silicon Valley, which claimed to be able to do blood tests incredibly with just a finger prick rather than taking a traditional vial. It was a hugely important story. It not only exposed a terrible fraud that was going on, it told you an awful lot about Silicon Valley, about some of the excesses of Silicon Valley. It led to the collapse of that company, the prosecution of the chief executive, and indeed her imprisonment. She's now in prison, serving a prison sentence for 12 years. Enormously important story. That didn't get that much. That didn't get the Stormy Daniels level of attention. But as a piece of reporting that had real social utility, it was way, way, way more important. And I think the more we focus on that, but you're right, Will, it's expensive. That reporter who brilliantly did that story was working on that story for a year and a half before we were actually really able to publish anything, before we had the goods on the story. That's someone who's literally producing nothing in terms of the actual output of the paper for a year and a half, but then it becomes a blockbuster story. That is expensive, but it's incredibly valuable, and the more of that kind of reporting we have, I think the better.
Please, question.
Hello, sir. Thank you for your time today. My question is about the political system here in the United States. Why are there only two parties for such a country with huge population, huge diversity? Shouldn't there be more options for people with different ideologies? And why aren't there more options?
Yeah, it is an interesting point, and again, it's funny. The answer is, there are institutional reasons, which is that the way in which electoral law is actually arranged in this country makes it extremely hard for third parties even to get on the ballot in a lot of states. Ballot access is very, very hard. You need huge numbers of signatures in order to break through in many states to get through. You have to, the two parties have an entrenched place in the system. The deeper sort of almost conceptual philosophical argument is, look, elections are choices. And, ultimately, this is how democracy works. We're going to have a government. One party or other is going to be in government. The choice is between one or the other. That's been, where I grew up in Britain, that very much used to be the case as well. Two parties, Liberal and Conservatives for a long time, and then Labour and Conservatives for the last century. But interesting, it's broken down in Britain, and that, again, it's much easier for third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties, as you now have in Britain and in many European countries, to break through because there aren't the ballot restrictions, but because there is a demand for, for something beyond the two parties. And as the two parties have become more polarized, there has been particularly strong demand, I think, in this country. It has happened. We've seen it. In Ross Perot, famously, most recently, in 1992, and again in 1996. 1992 got almost 20% of the vote. If he got a little bit more, he would have started winning states and actually won electoral college. 1968, George Wallace, for the sort of states' rights campaign, won 11 million votes. I think actually won the electoral votes of 5 states. So it can happen. It can break through. But the system itself in many, many states is designed to prevent it happening. And this broader conceptual phenomenon in people's minds that, look, ultimately I've got, one government one party is going to be the government, and it's going to lead to more stable government, and I'm going to pick that government. But I think the other thing that's changed is that, until the last 20 years or so, the political parties themselves were very loose coalitions. The Republicans consisted of, a couple of Republicans were very big in California up until the 1990s. They had a lot of sort of liberal, kind of sort of liberal Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans they were called, in places like New York, obviously, along with conservatives, business interests, people who had sort of national, strong national security interests. It was a broad coalition. It's become there are very, very few liberal Republicans now. It's a much more kind of cohesive and tighter party. And on the Democratic side. I mean, of course, as you know, we know the Democratic Party was half of the party was the party of sort of the southern whites up until as late as the 1970s. Very conservative, extremely conservative Southern Democrats. Sort of strangely allied with, large number, the party that represented blacks in the north, but also liberal progressives. But that has now gone too. Those sort of, the white conservative voters tended to go to the Republicans. So you've got much more. So that might be an argument again why people hunger for a third party, because these parties they now encompass a much narrower range of the political spectrum on each side. And so I wouldn't rule out the possibility you could get a third party, but there are institutional and political constraints that make it hard.
Please, question.
I'd like to talk about academia. You mentioned about capture of institutions. The long march through institutions that people have written about. My long-term doubles partner is a retired ASU professor, and he's told me some interesting woke stories. Where has the educational system fallen down? And you kept talking about American values. Maybe you should list a few of those so people know what they haven't been taught about.
Yeah, thank you. It's a good question. Well, I probably should let Professor Hay answer the question, really, because he knows much more about it than I do as an academic. Well, again, like you, I've heard, and indeed we've reported on, and I've spoken to lots and lots of people in many of these institutions in which the hegemony of a particular progressive, whatever you want to call it, view of, especially in the humanities, but not confined to the humanities, the hegemony is ironclad. Dominates and has become increasingly so that it's increasingly hard for people who dissent from that broad woke progressive view to get opportunities, to get research opportunities, to get academic positions, certainly to get tenure, as these institutions become increasingly enclosed bodies, monolithically representing a very, very narrow part of what might be called the ideological spectrum, and work actively to exclude alternative dissenting views. So that is very, very well established, and there are legions of stories of people at universities across the country, from Ivy League universities. Princeton had a particular case not long ago of a professor, Josh Katz, who was essentially, on trumped-up charges relating to supposed misbehavior, was kicked out of the university. But it was clear because he had opposed the direction that the humanities department in particular had gone. There are dozens of these stories. I've spoken to academics and who speak out and tell me that, for everyone who speaks out against this climate of narrow, if you like, sort of narrow exclusivity, for everyone that speaks out, there are 10 who daren't speak out because they may not have tenure, they may not feel secure enough in their position to be able to do that, knowing that they will face retribution. So I think that problem is clear. The values I'm talking about, well, funnily enough, one of the first of them is freedom of expression, and the idea that the free exchange of ideas is of value in itself, and a broad and the principle of being allowed that freedom is not only morally right, and after all, that is essentially what American democracy, the American ideal was really founded on, freedom. The American republic was founded on, but actually that it also produces better outcomes, that the more exchange of ideas you have, the more you expose bad ideas to argument, the better your ideas become, the better your collective ideas become. So freedom, that to me, that is a critical value of American value that I would identify. I mean, I'd also say it's not just a purely American value. The principle of free expression has been well established in other countries too, but it is, I think, identifiably American, and I think that has been profoundly undermined in not just in universities, but in the media and in businesses. I mean, I talk as a Wall Street Journal, as the editor of the Wall Street Journal, I talk to business leaders all the time, and they felt this same pressure to exclude voices that are critical of this kind of progressive consensus they've had. We've had huge stories like places like Google and Facebook and others where people who have spoken out on issues of race or gender in a way, again, that is deemed to be unacceptable by the majority, by the people who hold that view, who've lost their jobs and who've been literally lost their jobs as a result of it. So I think that there are lots of others too, but that is the most important American ideal, American freedom, principle of democracy, principle of freedom that I think is central to what I think of as not only America's character, but America's great success, that I think has been under siege in the last 10 years or so. And you're seeing a bit of a backlash to it. You're seeing, new universities crop up. You're seeing, we just talked about new media outlets crop up that are challenging this consensus. But to do so from within the existing institutions is incredibly challenging, incredibly hard.
One more question before we move on to a book signing.
I wanted to ask Mr. Baker the relationship between accountability, transparency, good governance, and trust, because it seems like since the Church Commission, maybe before, we've equated accountability with transparency, and yet at the same time introducing microphones and speakers and everything into committee hearings and turning them into circuses may have hurt good governance, and it may have soured the American people on Congress's ability to do its job. So is there a relationship between accountability and transparency, and can it go too far?
Yeah, it's a very good question. As you say, I mean, it has become widely accepted in this country. Interestingly, not in all Western democracies. Britain again still excludes, has a certain degree of opacity, shall we say, in some of its proceedings, particularly in legal proceedings. But it's become kind of broadly accepted here in this country that letting the air in, sunshine laws, exposing as much of our deliberations and activities of our institutions to public attention is, generally speaking, going to be better for it. And we can all see the argument for that. We know that if people behave differently, and I think probably arguably more virtuously, or at least in ways that make them more responsive to the public, if their deliberations are held in public. I mean, we just know that. That's human nature and common sense. So you can see the argument for that. At the same time, the flip side, the deleterious aspect of that, is that our institutions then become kind of public spectacles. And I do think it is a factor. It's a good point. It is a factor in the kind of diminution of the quality of our political leadership, particularly in Congress. Congress has increasingly become a kind of a circus for people to perform in, largely, trying to audition for roles on Fox News or MSNBC, because they're not interested in doing the work of Congress, of the tedious, difficult, sort of back-breaking work of putting legislation together that will pass through, both houses of Congress. That's just hard work, and ultimately not very rewarding. Whereas standing up and using your platform in Congress to denounce your opponents and get yourself a spot on the news is immediately rewarding, both in terms of your own public profile and ultimately many of these people go off and take very lucrative jobs in the media. So yeah, I think it is. I think there's no question that is That's been a consequence of this openness. My only concern, though, is my feeling is it's probably a price we may have to pay for that, because I think the idea of going back to a time when, again, whether it's deliberations of local government, or whether it's deliberations of Congress, or whether it's court, in this country, some courts, some states do allow television cameras into judicial proceedings. Federal doesn't, and so other states don't too. I think by and large, the benefits of transparency, of exposing the activities of powerful people to the public, broadly speaking, are beneficial. But the price we have to pay for that is that sometimes we will produce circus clowns and performers performing for us who want to do that rather than actually do the work of governing.
Well, I know we have a few more questions as time runs out, but we can have those informally with the book signing. Let me express my appreciation to our Arizona PBS partners who've helped record this program, and to our events and marketing staff who have helped us put it all together, and of course to our audience, but above all to Gerry Baker for coming and speaking for us.
Thank you very much.